I'm going to invite the members of the panel to introduce themselves, except for Dr. Wilsey. I'm going to read for you his biography from the back of the book, or actually it's the inside of the back cover. But I'm also going to add that if you want to find or if you want to experience an impressive CV, you should get your hands on Dr. Wilsey's CV. He is an impressive scholar. So in the back flap of the book, it says, John D. Wilsey is professor of church history and chair of the Department of Church History and Historical Theology at the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary in Louisville. He is also a research fellow with the Center for Religion, Culture, and Democracy. His publications include American Exceptionalism and Civil Religion, Reassessing the History of an Idea, and God's Cold Warrior, The Life and Faith of John Foster Dulles. Heartily commend those works to you, and I'm going to invite now our two brothers to introduce themselves to us.
Is anybody else in here a little warm? If you could just hold your breaths for 1 hour, it'll be fine. Okay. Now I'm Denny Burk. I'm a professor at Boyce College. At least I used to be. I've been on sabbatical all semester, so if you've been wondering where I am, or perhaps you didn't miss me at all, that's where I've been. So good to be here.
Yeah, they've already mentioned my name is Jason Thacker, soon to be Dr. Thacker, not yet. The already, but not yet. I did pass my defense last week. That was good. Well, thanks. I teach philosophy and ethics here at Boyce College and Southern Seminary, and also serve as a senior fellow in bioethics, as well as the director of the Research Institute at the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission.
Great. Thank you, brothers. My name is Jim Hamilton. I'm professor of biblical theology here at Southern, and I'm delighted to be part of this. So, Dr. Wilsey, thank you so much for this book. I have really enjoyed reading it, and I would really encourage you all to devote some time that you can read this book slowly and ponder its message. I told you how much I appreciate this quote from page 13, and I'd like to read this quote and then invite you to elaborate on it, give us the context for it. So you're discussing the way that what we have is an American experiment, a test of whether that nation or any nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure, quoting the Gettysburg Address. And then you write, Catholic integralism, magisterial Christian nationalism, and progressive utopianism or nihilism can only exist in the mind. But the American constitutional order exists here and now, and is made up of actual people, dead, living, and yet to be born. Could you give us a brief exposition of that?
Yes, and I want to thank all of you all, my friends, my brothers. Y'all are wonderful. The sermon this morning was spot on, Dr. Hamilton. It's always a pleasure to see, and God be praised for this, but a master at his craft behind the pulpit. And so we are thankful for you, thankful for the bookstore, and all of you for coming to this event. It is overwhelming to see all of you here. You are all my treasured students and colleagues, and I'm very grateful for all of you. So yes, on page 13, I contrast integralism, Christian nationalism in the mold of Stephen Wolfe, and progressive utopianism. You could also call that revolutionary Marxism. So critical race theory would be part of that. Any kind of theory with some kind of gender or sexuality or race as a modifier for that would be part of that. Those things are utopian in that they are castles in the sky. They are abstractions. They're simply rooted in the ideal, and that is in the mind. They're not expressions in reality. They are not concrete. And for a conservative, conservatives believe that utopian sort of ideal kind of constructions like that are bad. It's easy to critique our constitutional order because it's here. It's in the now. We can see it. We live it. It's easy to critique that. We can always pick out the flaws in our constitutional order. It's very difficult to critique revolutionary Marxism or critique, magisterial Christian nationalism because they don't exist. So because they don't exist, how do you critique something that doesn't actually exist? And then the statement that actual people dead, living, and yet to be born, that comes from a very famous quote from Edmund Burke. Edmund Burke in critiquing John Locke's social contract theory, which again was a pure abstraction. He said that society is indeed a contract, but it's not an abstract contract. It's a contract between real people, the dead, those that have gone before us. We've received the inheritance of tradition from the dead, from our forefathers. So the dead, the living, and those who have yet to be born, those generations that have yet to come. That's what society is actually made of. And one last thing I'll say about that. In progressive worldview, with Rousseau as sort of the founder of modern progressivism, the modern left, and Thomas Paine, who is his disciple, they conceive society as only consisting of the living. But conservatives see society consisting of the dead, the living, and the yet to be born. That's why we're pro-life. That's why we revere tradition. That's why we have actual religious authority that we recognize in the Bible.
So what would you say to a magisterial Christian nationalist or a Marxist who says, well, actually, that has existed before in the world? There have been times in history where we had something like Christian nationalism in Western Europe and elsewhere. Or even a Marxist would say, well, maybe it's not a Marxist regime based on the identity categories that we're used to now, but certainly we've had Marxist regimes in the world. How do you respond to that?
Yeah. So the first would be Marxist regimes. Anybody who knows anything about the history of the 20th century and the 21st century would know that Marxism is the greatest murderer in terms of an idea than any other idea imaginable in history. The Soviet Union murdered 20 million of its own people in the Stalinist purges in the 1930s and in the 1940s. Mao murdered 30 million people in China during the Cultural Revolution, what he called the Great Leap Forward. The murderous regimes of Southeast Asia, Cambodia, North Vietnam, Laos, the amount of death because of Marxism it's just off the charts. In terms of the other side, those that would say that some kind of magisterial Christian nationalist program, we've had that. One thing I find interesting about Catholic integralists and Protestant Christian nationalists is that they don't appeal to history. They don't actually ever say, okay, well, what we're looking for is something like the Holy Roman Empire.
John, could you define both of those? I'm not sure everybody knows what integralism is.
Okay, so Catholic integralism...
or Christian nationalism.
Yeah, so Catholic integralism, authors like Adrian Vermeule, he's probably the most prominent of the integralists. Adrian Vermeule, Patrick Deneen, Phimister, what's his first name? Alan Phimister? Anyway, these are some examples of Catholic integralists. What they aspire to is a regime that is monarchical and also papist. So something like the Holy Roman Empire, which has the emperor and the papacy, and they're in alliance together, and they are both rulers of the entity of the Holy Roman Empire. Now, they want some kind of return to that. Magisterial Christian nationalists like Stephen Wolfe, they want to see a polity that at the head of it is what's called a Christian prince, Protestant, and an established church, preferably if you're a Stephen Wolfe, the Presbyterian Church. So an established Presbyterian church and a Christian prince. one thing I find interesting about the Christian Prince is a king priest. If you read Stephen Wolfe's book, chapter 7, the Christian Prince is a king and a priest. Wolfe describes this office as the highest office, higher even than a pastor, the highest office in the land. So this is an established monarchy. These things, I don't know of. Well, first of all, Catholic integralists and Christian nationalists don't ever appeal to history. They don't appeal to concrete examples. To say, okay, look at this example in history, and this is what will work.
Henry VIII.
Henry VIII. They don't even appeal to Henry VIII. They don't appeal to anybody in history. In fact, Stephen Wolfe will say, I'm not interested in looking to history. This is not a historical argument. He's not interested in tradition. He doesn't call himself a conservative. He's on the right, but he's not a conservative. So these things are not concrete theories. They are abstractions. They are counter-revolutionary, reactionary, utopian. So it's the same method that revolutionary Marxists use.
So what do you say then? So I appreciate your emphasis in here of wanting to conserve what we have, which is wonderful. I agree with that. But what do you say to the critics, especially, this is what I hear from the Christian nationalists all the time. Liberalism is dead. It's failed. We're on the other side of it. It's over. You say you want to preserve it. They say it's gone. We don't have anything. If you've got, if liberalism is, cross-dressing story hour, what do they call it? Drag queen story hour. Sorry, I forgot what it's called. If liberalism includes that, then it's over. Is that what you want to conserve?
Yes, that is a simplistic and reductionistic and straw man argument, and I totally reject that. What is the etymology of liberalism? What is at the root of the term liberalism? Freedom. Anybody want to be free? How's that sound to y'all? Raise your hand if you want to be free. Okay, I'm down with that. So if you say that liberalism is dead, so you're saying freedom is dead. Okay, that's what they're saying. That is what they're saying, right? So what's their alternative? Authoritarianism, a Christian prince that is a king priest. You read Stephen Wolfe's descriptions of the Christian prince. It's God on earth. I mean, raise your hand if you want that. So somebody raised their hand back there. I think it was in jest. I think it was Sam back there. I think it was in jest. And one other thing I'll say is that what I say in the book is the good thing is that each of these groups of people, first of all, among the Catholic integralists, people like Patrick Deneen, Adrian Vermeule, Stephen Wolfe, we do have a lot in common with these people. They are, some of them are our brothers in Christ. We have, we each share a passion for the unborn. We each share a passion for the sanctity of life and of marriage. We are all alarmed and deeply distressed and vexed by the secular turn that America has taken over the last century and a half. However, the answer is not to turn to make an authoritarian turn. The answer is to retrieve the federal tradition that is outlined for us in the Constitution. So I'm not really advocating for a retrieval of liberalism, although I think that we could discuss that. What I'm really asking for is a retrieval of federalism. Federalism, which is predicated upon division of power, not concentrating power in any one person or institution of government, and checks and balances. A right relationship of the states to the federal government, and a right relationship and a staying within one's own lane of the Congress and the executive and the judiciary. That's how that's what we should retrieve. and it's retrievable because it's actually there. It's concrete. You can't retrieve anything if you're a magisterial Christian nationalist. There's nothing to retrieve. It doesn't exist. It never has. So that's my answer to that.
That's something I really appreciate about your book in general, but more so even you as a man and a scholar, is that you slow down to ask, like, well, what do you mean by that? That's something I always try to tell students, is to slow down and say, what do you mean by that? Because I think it's easy, especially where liberal becomes a pejorative term, is to say, actually, what is liberalism? There's a progressive, Alistair McIntyre once famously said in his After Virtue, you have conservative liberals, you have progressive liberals, and you have libertarian liberals. Yep. If you believe in the individual, the idea of rights and liberty and freedom, you are in some sense a type of liberal. Right. And again, it's not like we're having to go back and say we can talk about the relative merits of liberalism, but actually slowing down to define our terms. And that's something that I appreciate in the book, especially in that introduction, that you slow down to say, look, the American experiment's not perfect, but it's real. It's real people, it's real sins, it does have excesses, and I think that's something that I would love to hear you elaborate on. Is I know many today are, at least it's appealing to hear someone stand up for truth in the public square. It's appealing to say, look, there are some excesses of progressive liberalism, particularly of that vein. There are some excesses. That's something I appreciate about Denny. His Why Liberalism Failed, that was published a number of years ago by Yale. I like some of his descriptive of the current state of things and the excesses. But as you said, the project he wants to put forth, his Aristopopulism and why regime change, it's not appealing to me at all. Can you help us to see kind of some of the excesses of kind of the liberal order, classically define some of the excesses, and why many may be kind of appealing to, or at least open to, this kind of Protestant magisterialism or Catholic integralism? What's appealing about those things, especially maybe for a younger generation, which I know you wrote this book for?
I think what's appealing is that in an authoritarian context, it's a way to solve problems, and solve them quickly. If I have say an obstreperous student in my class, I see a lot of my students in here. A lot of them are troublemakers,
They are your students.
I'm sorry.
They are your students.
They are my students, after all. Let's say I have one in particular. I've been teaching a long time. I can think of individual students in my career that have been particularly obstreperous and a problem. Those are always the ones that have perfect attendance too. So, one solution is to deal with a student who's unruly. It's to kill him. You just kill him. And that does solve the problem. It's just that you have a whole bunch of new problems now. And some of the problems you can foresee, but most of the problems that you have when you do that, you don't foresee. And in the same sense, let's grant Stephen Wolf's project of Christian nationalism. I mean, if you read his book, just let me get a show of hands. Raise your hand if you've read The Case for Christian Nationalism. Okay? How many of you have read parts of that book? Okay? A significant number of you. How many of you are aware of the book? Okay, good. It's 478 pages, and it is a very tight argument. It's very logical. That's something else that's very appealing. He gives very clear definitions. He doesn't beat around the bush as to what he means by a Christian nation and what nationalism entails. That's appealing. He's very clear. It's very coherent. It's a very tight argument. But what was my point that I was going to make? I know what it was. Okay. This happens to me sometimes. It's so tight. The argument is so tight. It's so persuasive. It's so good. It's too good. Because he answers every question. He answers every objection in this book. If anybody who's ever read the book, you see him answering all these possible objections to his program, just like Aquinas. It's like Thomistic. He's got all his possible objections laid out, and he answers all of them. You're like, wow. You come to the end of it. Well, I guess you got it all figured out then, right? I love it when a plan comes together. It's just that, like anybody who's an athlete knows that when you go out on that field, or you go out on that court, best laid plans tend to kind of fall apart when you actually, meet your opponent on the field. All kinds of problems and challenges can arise with a utopian, abstract, deductive argument that you can't even imagine ever coming up. And I think it's ironic that Stephen Wolfe, being a committed Calvinist Presbyterian guy, doesn't ever really give any real room for human depravity. I mean, that Christian prince, the Christian magistrate, in answering an objection, what if the Christian magistrate becomes a heretic? And he says, well, that would never happen because he reads the Bible. Oh, okay. I didn't know that was the antidote. Simple as that. All you got to do is read the Bible. You won't be a heretic. So he believes in human depravity, but he doesn't take a realistic consideration of what human depravity is capable of. But if we look at history, this is why you got to study American history. In American history, we see what the weaknesses of the federal order have been, what the weaknesses of liberalism have been, what liberalism is allowed for. And, you can take a page out of history and you can learn from wisdom in the past. And that is a biblical principle, to acquire wisdom by reading history, by looking to the past. What does the experience of human beings tell us about how to proceed in the future?
Thanks for that. In the chapter that I mentioned this morning on conservatism and the imagination, you have an extensive discussion of Augustine and his ontology, epistemology, and ethics, and it seems that you align those thoughts with the transcendentals, the good, the true, and the beautiful. Could you tell us about that and kind of elaborate on those points for us?
Yeah. So I'm very attracted to Augustine as a model for kind of building our conservative worldview, because Augustine places God at the center of his worldview. Russell Kirk, when he wrote The Conservative Mind, he has his 6 canons of conservatism at the very beginning. And his very first canon of a conservative mind is belief in the transcendent. Now, you don't have to be a Christian to be a conservative, but you do need to believe in a transcendent order. And I would say you do need to believe in God to be a true conservative. And going from there, if it's true that belief in God, belief in the transcendent is necessary, and maybe the first canon of a conservative disposition, then placing God at the center of your worldview, your center of the way you see reality, seems to me to be the pinnacle of what it means to be a conservative. Placing God at the center of your worldview places truth, goodness, and beauty at the center of your worldview. Augustine says, do you want to know truth? Then seek after God, and you will have truth. Do you want to know goodness? Then seek after God, and you will have goodness. Do you want to know what beauty is? Seek after God. Beauty is not in the eye of the beholder. Beauty is found in God. Beauty is objective. Truth is objective, real, transcendent. It's there whether we live or die. It's there whether we have a good opinion or a bad opinion. It's there whether we live by it or not. It's always there because God is always there. So Augustine is a model for us because he orders his worldview and the way he views reality with God at the center. And this is what, to me, frames a conservative disposition.
John, one of the things that really surprised me in the book was that you came out so strong affirming two-spirit identity, which, has anybody ever heard of that before, two-spirit? Nobody even knows what it is. Okay, it's not a gender identity. Two-spirit identity is something else. It's something from de Tocqueville. And you say that the American experiment has always, you agree with him saying that it's always had the spirit of freedom and the spirit of religion. And then you make the claim not only that is correct and that is our identity, but that conservatives are in the best position to defend that and to preserve that. Could you explain that?
Absolutely. Okay, let me just get it. I'm just curious. How many of you have read part or all of Democracy in America by Alexis de Tocqueville? Okay, a lot of you might have probably read it in high school. Tocqueville came to America in 1831. He was here for a little bit over 9 months as a French visitor, and he toured around America between May of 1831 and he left in February of 1832. And he wrote Democracy in America based on his observations of American culture, American institutions, American political life. And he makes a statement that, in France, the French have not been able to maintain the harmony between the spirit of freedom and the spirit of religion. Those have been at odds with one another in France. And think about that context. Revolutionary France, the revolution beginning in 1789, the terror in 1793, the rise of Napoleon in 1798, Napoleonic Wars until 1814, the fall of Napoleon in 1815, the restoration of the monarchy in 1815, the French Revolution of 1830, the July Revolution. In France, there's been no stability at all, and there's no freedom. So religion and freedom in France have been at odds. But in America, America had a revolution. America had, this experience of revolution. But in America, Americans have maintained the spirit of religion and freedom. And so when he writes Democracy in America, he wants his French countrymen to learn those lessons that Americans can teach them. And he says that Americans have maintained that harmony. Conservatives are in the best. You and I, if you're a conservative, that means you are in the best position to maintain and extend and preserve that harmony and hand it down, because conservatives care about tradition. We're not traditionalists in the sense that we worship tradition. We receive tradition critically. Not all traditions are good, not all traditions are moral, and not all traditions are practical. So we do, as conservatives, receive tradition critically, but we revere tradition as a category. Progressives don't revere tradition. Progressives don't look to the past. Progressives are concerned about the present, and progressives believe that everything is going to get better in the future, the doctrine of inevitable progress. Conservatives look to the past. Conservatives look to tradition, and they consider tradition to be a gift, an inheritance that we've received from our fathers and our mothers. It's another example of concreteness. Our forefathers, your forefathers. Think about your mother, your father, your grandmothers and your grandfathers, your aunts and uncles, your teachers, your pastors, all those people that meant something to you, gave you something, that were older than you, that taught you something, those that have died and gone on before. And you celebrate their lives and you have memories of them. Maybe you have pictures of them hanging in your house or in your apartment or in your dorm room. You remember them. You honor their memory. You've received an inheritance, a gift, a trust that's sacred from them. And you revere them, and you prepare and you steward that trust, and you get ready to hand it down to your children and your grandchildren. And someday when you're gone, it's your hope and your prayer that your children and your grandchildren will benefit and be blessed as you were. Just as we read in Hebrews 11, we might not see the fulfillment of the promise in our lifetimes, but we don't conserve tradition because we're doing so for our own sake. We're conserving tradition for the sake of our children and our grandchildren, even if they're not born yet. I want to conserve the harmony between religion and freedom for my daughters, and one day for my grandchildren, who I don't have grandchildren yet, but someday I will. And I want them to enjoy what I've enjoyed, even after I'm gone. That's what a conservative does. Progressives have the progressive worldview, I should say that. The progressive worldview has no room for that.
That's one of the things that's encouraging about this work, but also just your work in general, is you're putting forth a positive vision. I think it's very easy, especially from our little, front of our iPhones with Twitter pulled up and our thumbs going super fast, to be super critical, to tear down. But you're putting forth, and even a lot of political philosophy today seems to be very hypercritical. Let's tear things down, but you're actually seeking to build something. Something you mentioned earlier, I wanted to see if you'd unpack a little bit. It always, reading your work, and even what my Religion and Public Square students are going through, we're talking about the relative merits I told you the other day of liberal democracy, thinking through religious freedom this next week and that integral relationship. Reminds me of a quote from Reinhold Niebuhr where he says, "Man's capacity for justice makes democracy possible, but man's inclination toward injustice makes democracy necessary." Speaking of the role of sin and the realness, the brokenness of our world, how does the conservative tradition take into account the brokenness, the fallenness of man, the selfish arrogance, pride that, Augustine so much says marks the earthly city? It's one of those things, even in the earthly city, we can have, in his words, splendid vices. There's these vices, there's this sin that permeates the selfishness, but that virtue that marks the heavenly city, that defining virtue, is that of humility. Help us to understand the way that conservatism not only looks at the real world as it is, but also as an account for sin. Because when we think of democracy, when we think of the American experiment, we think of religious freedom, it's made up of real people, just like all of us who are broken, flawed, imperfect, selfish, arrogant, prideful. Even those of us who may come off very humble, it can be done in a very prideful way. How does the conservative tradition help us to acknowledge the realities of brokenness and sin that is a determined category in the Scripture as we think through the best available political theories and political philosophies of our day?
I'm so glad you asked. Okay, so in the book, I deal with that question specifically in a chapter called Conservatism and History. And I tell the story of General A.P. Hill, who was the commander of the 3rd Corps in Lee's army, Lee's Confederate Army. This is a man who has had 4 funerals. He only died once, but he had 4 funerals because his body kept getting dug up and moved. And most recently, his body was dug up in 2022 and moved to Culpeper from Richmond because his statue was taken down, and his statue was actually his grave marker, and his body was buried in the plinth of the statue. So conservatives take into account a great tension that exists in human nature. On the one hand, you and I are, we're great sinners. Think Romans 3, Isaiah 59, Romans 6. I mean, just Genesis 3. And again, I'm just gonna speak in real and concrete terms. We won't speak of sin in abstract terms. Well, let's just talk. I tell you what. Let's talk about me. I'm a sinner. My wife and kids are here. You talk to Sally, my youngest daughter. She will be glad to tell you in concrete terms, like a conservative, what a sinner that I am. We all know that we are sinners. We all know what we struggle with. We know what we grapple with. We know what the consequences of sin are. Because we haven't died and gone to hell, but we all know and we've all seen what our sin does in our own life and in the lives of those that we love the most. So that's one real aspect of our nature. But there's another aspect of our nature in tension with that, and that is that we are all created in the image of God. So if we think about, say, Isaiah 59, your sins have separated you from your God so that you will not hear. Think about Psalm 8. Psalm 8, talking about, that God created us a little lower than the angels. Or think about Genesis 1, 26 through 28. Or Genesis 9, about the image of God. You and I have in unspeakable dignity because we bear his image. Jesus died on the cross for us. He didn't die on the cross for our pets or the animals in the wild or plants or stones or anything like that. He died for us. And so there's that tension, a tension between incredible dignity and sin that condemns us to eternity in hell. And in history, a conservative holds that tension together. A person who is immature and childish cannot hold two realities in tension. It's impossible. Children, immature people, have to have one or the other. So with A.P. Hill, he fought for the Confederacy. He was evil. He fought for the wrong side. He was on the dark side, like Star Wars. So we have to cancel him. We have to dig him up and tear down his statue and send him off, his bones, because he's like the bad guy. He's the bad guy. That's childish. It's immature. It's the sign of a mind that cannot hold two opposing realities in tension. The fully formed conscience can hold two realities in tension. And ultimately, Christianity reconciles the tension in Christ. It's in Christ that the tension is resolved. Therefore, there is now no condemnation for those who are in Christ, who walk according to the Spirit. In Romans 7, Paul is grappling with the fact that he concurs with the law of God, demonstrating himself to be in the image of God, and yet he does those things he doesn't want to do, demonstrating himself to be a sinner. He is tempted to despair, but then you keep reading to Romans 8:1, and he sees how the tension is resolved. A conservative can hold those tensions together because a conservative seeks a fully formed conscience.
I loved reading about the Wilsey re-education program.
Amen.
And I'd love to have you talk to us about both what you're doing as a historian as you make a case for religious liberty and how you think about, say, applying that as you watch a movie, and maybe instruct us on how we can in a more sophisticated, more beneficial way, more profitable way, experience art in the form of, movies and films in our culture.
Man, I'm so glad you brought up the Wilsey Re-Education program.
Will you tell the story of how that got started?
Yeah. So I have very strong opinions about movies.
Really?
You don't say.
Yeah, shocker. So when I taught at Southwestern Seminary, that school that will remain unnamed, I'm just kidding. One of the things we did at Southwestern when I was down there was we had a fully accredited Bachelor of Science degree in Biblical Studies on the Houston campus. Dr. Hamilton, where you taught. Yes, sir. And I taught at that same campus. And we had an extension campus at a prison, a maximum security prison in the Texas Department of Criminal Justice. And this was at the Darrington unit. It's now called the Memorial unit. And I would teach my classes, and if you've ever had me for a class, you know that I'll often bring up movie quotes and movie references. And I would do this with the men in the prison in my classes, and they didn't know what I was talking about. They had never seen any of these movies. I mean, they hadn't been in prison all their lives, They'd been free at some point, and I used to say, have y'all been in prison since you were babies? You've never seen any of these movies? So I would bring up movies like John Wayne's The Cowboys. They had never seen it. Patton. They'd never seen it. Anyway, so I just said, okay, y'all are going to see some movies. I'm going to bring in some movies. So on some Saturdays, some days in the summer, even on, I'd say we're just not going to have class today. We're just going to watch a movie. So I showed them The Scarlet Pimpernel. I showed them The Cowboys. I showed them Patton. I showed him Glory. I showed him a few other movies. I can't remember all of them. But they loved him. I remember it was such a cool thing. They had never seen The Cowboys. If you've never seen The Cowboys, to see 40 grown men who were in prison for having committed capital offenses, half the class sobbing at the end of the movie was just unbelievable. So I said to myself, I got to put this list together, and because I wanted to show it to my own kids and show it to other students. And so it's a list of about 60 titles. And I talk about it in chapter 4. And I talk about a movie called Fail-Safe. Anybody ever seen Fail-Safe? Okay, got a couple. Everybody in my family's seen it. And Bradley Blakeman has seen it for some strange reason. I think he's trying to butter up Dr. Wilsey for some weird reason I don't know. So anyway, I'm watching you back there, Bradley. So Fail-Safe is a movie about a threatened nuclear apocalypse, and it's a story about the responsibility that comes with our free choices. May I read a passage? Yes, please. So these are lines from the movie. There's an American bomber that has received orders to drop hydrogen bombs on Moscow, but it was a mistake, and so the bomber is on its way to nuke Moscow. The president is on the hotline with the Soviet premier, and it's just minutes before the climactic moment, and I'm not going to tell you what happens, but here's a few lines from the movie. The Soviet premier says, "Mr. President, I've ordered our long-range missiles to stand down from their alert. Only that part of our defense that has a chance of shooting down your bomber is still active. We do not think we have much of a chance." The president says, "I know." The Soviet premier says, "And yet this was nobody's fault." The president says, "I don't agree." The Soviet premier, "No human being did wrong. No one is to be blamed." American president, "We're to blame, both of us. We let our machines get out of hand." Soviet premier, "Still, it was an accident." The president, "Two great cities may be destroyed, millions of innocent people killed. What do we say to them, Mr. Chairman? Accidents will happen? I don't accept that." Soviet premier, "All I know is, as long as we have weapons," and the president interrupted him and said, "All I know is that men are responsible. We're responsible for what happens to us. Today we had a taste of the future. Do we learn from it, or do we go on the way that we have? What do we do, Mr. Chairman? What do we say to the dead?" Soviet premier, "I think if we are men, we must say that this will not happen again. But do you think it's possible with all that stands between us?" American president, "We put it there, Mr. Chairman. We are not helpless. What we put between us, we can remove." With freedom comes responsibility. Freedom is not license. Freedom is ordered by just law. That's how we know what freedom really is. And when it comes to religious freedom is no exception.
So would you have advice for us on how we should pay attention while we're watching movies, what we should look for, what we should watch for?
Yeah. You should watch for virtue and redemption. You should watch for the fallen state of humanity in concrete expressions. You should look for, I'm going to say this in the transcendental terms, but look for what's true. Look for what's beautiful and look for what's good. And those things that are not true or that militate against goodness or are ugly, note what those are and take the lessons that you learn in art and in film and in music and let your imagination be inspired by them and also know what counterfeit truth, falsehood, ugliness, and those things which are bad. Be sensitive to those things as well. And art forms our imagination, and from our imagination we live out in concrete reality.